Tantor Audio presents The Mountain of Light by Indu Sundaresan. Narrated by Shah. Author's Note. In April 1850, Lord Dalhousie, the British Governor-General of India, ordered the 186-carat Kohinoor diamond secreted from Bombay to London to adorn the arm of his sovereign, Queen Victoria. Until the diamond reached England, very few people knew it had even left India. The reason for this furtiveness was the general discontent in India as Dalhousie annexed the lands of the Punjab Empire to those of British India and dispossessed the boy king of the Punjab, Maharaja Dalip Singh, of his throne, his kingdom, and the massive wealth of his Toshakhana, the treasury house. The young Maharaja was also the last Indian owner of the Kohinoor. Although the Kohinoor had belonged to the monarchs of England for the last 163 years, the diamond has a deep reach into Indian history. According to legend, Lord Krishna gave it to a disciple in response to his meditations many thousands of years ago. More contemporarily, the first recorded mention of the Kohinoor occurs in the memoirs of Emperor Babur, who established the Mughal Empire in 1526 and received the diamond from one of the Rajas whom he defeated. The diamond then slips in and out of India, possessed in its departures by the kings of Persia and Afghanistan. Nadir Shah, king of Persia, gives it its name, calling it a veritable Kohinoor, a mountain of light. In 1809, the ruler of Afghanistan, Shah is dethroned by his brother. Shuja turns to the ruler of the Punjab, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, for help in regaining Afghanistan and promises Ranjit the Kohinoor in return. This is where the Mountain of Light begins. And at this point, at Ranjit Singh's court, the history of the Kohinoor becomes inextricably linked with the British in India. The first ship from the English East India Company touched Indian shores in 1608 during Mughal rule, and for the next 100 years or so, the company fought to gain a trade treaty with the Mughal kings, excluding the already present Portuguese and Dutch in India. As the Mughal Empire disintegrated, the company acquired influence. It lent armies to various independent kings as they seceded from Mughal lands, and claimed harsh compensations, indiscriminate use of the king's armies and treasuries that fell just a little short of actual rule. The board of directors of the company grew massively rich and corrupt, it was said, controlling vast chunks of India, nominally on behalf of their sovereign in England. In 1773, a regulating act in the British Parliament limited the company's powers in India, and established the presence of a Crown-appointed, Court of Directors-approved Governor-General. In the Mountain of Light, when the Afghan ruler Shah comes to the Punjab in the early 1800s with the Kohinoor diamond, there is a flurry of interest in him. Maharaja Ranjit Singh wants the Kohinoor. The British want Shuja to set him up as a puppet king in Afghanistan. Years after Ranjit Singh gets the Kohinoor from Shuja, in 1838, a British embassy arrives at his court in the form of the British Governor-General of India, Lord Auckland, and his sisters, Emily and Fanny Eden. Auckland wants the ailing and aging Punjab Maharaja's help in invading Afghanistan, which Ranjit Singh does not agree to, and which eventually becomes one of the most disastrous wars the British fight in Asia. After Ranjit Singh dies, soon after Auckland's visit, 4 of his sons are killed in wars of succession, leaving only the 6-year-old Prince Dalip Singh as heir to his father's empire, and the Kohinoor diamond. While the British did not dare to invade the Punjab under the powerful Ranjit Singh's rule, they now managed to lodge a foot into the door to the empire, and eventually annex the Punjab to British lands in India. Although Dalip Singh was called a Maharaja until the end of his life, it was an empty title, and his was a flimsy, unsubstantial crown. During the lengthy process of annexation, Henry Lawrence, a company employee, comes to the Punjab as the British resident along with his brother John. The Lawrence brothers are in charge of cataloguing the wealth of the Punjab Empire and facilitating the shift of power from the Maharaja Dalip Singh to the East India Company. However dismal their duties, they both, with great diplomacy, manage cordial relations with the Indians they meet during the annexation. Maharaja Dalip Singh loses his Punjab and his Kohinoor diamond, which becomes the property of the Queen of England. He follows it to London when he's 16 years old, and is feted and petted there for a long while, until he realizes that all the compensation granted to him cannot make up for the loss of his lands and his diamond. 4 years after Maharaja Dalip Singh comes to England in 1858, the British government dissolves the East India Company, and Victoria becomes Queen Empress of India. Colonialism begins in India at this date. All of a sudden, the British are no longer traders or company men. They are the masters. The British Raj has begun. Here, then, in the Mountain of Light, are the final chapters of the Kohinoor's existence in India, and the last few years before India loses her sovereignty and becomes a British colony. Fragment of Light. June 1817. The midday sun leaned over to place its fiery kiss upon the Shalimar Gardens in Lahore, 4.5 miles east of the fort and walled city. The blazing light wavered into a haze around the almond, guava, and mango trees, and except under the trees where it could not penetrate, all shadows leached into the blistering ground. The Shalimar Gardens, the abode of pleasure, was a name taken by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan from the gardens his father had built in the valley of Kashmir. In the late 1630s, the Ravi River in Lahore flooded its banks. Angry waters swamped and carved out new geographical features, shifting vast quantities of mud from one place to another, leaving acclivities and declivities where none had existed before. One such slope in the land was born after this flood. So it was here Emperor Shah Jahan ordered the garden to be built in 3 terraces that descended from the south to the north. At high noon on this day of June 1817, 2 young men tarried in the central platform of the pool in the middle terrace. They were both bareheaded, their chests bare also. Each wore only a kispet, long tight shorts of buffalo hide leather, which covered them from their waists down, the ends rucked up over their knees to facilitate ease of movement. The upper halves of their bodies, and their legs and feet, glistened with sesame oil, pungent and aromatic in the sear of the sun. Earlier in the morning, according to the rules of the game, they had smoothed the oil on each other. It was the first and last gesture of amity and goodwill. For their referee, they had corralled an old gardener lounging in the deep shade of the nearby tamarind tree, a hand-rolled beedi wrapped in his fist, smoke coiling out from between his fingers. "Him?" Ibrahim Khan had asked, thick eyebrows elevated in disbelief. His sovereign had shrugged, lifting massive, muscled shoulders. "As good as anyone else, Ibrahim. We know the rules ourselves. The only other man around is Zaman, and he's useless, as you know. Should I have to call upon one of the flowers in my zanana instead?" Ibrahim grinned. "With respect, Your Majesty, the women of your harem will only support you, and they're likely to squeal or curse in horror when I defeat you. Calling on them is not conducive to an even playing field." A small smile flitted across Shah Shuja's face, and when it did, it lightened his features, brought a sparkle to his gray eyes, erased the embedded lines of worry on his forehead, made him, so Ibrahim thought, more like the deeply powerful man he had known all his life. A tiny spear of ache stabbed Ibrahim's heart. They were far removed from what they had once been. Shuja had been born of a king, Shah Timur Durrani, whose father had established the Afghan Empire in the name of the Durrani dynasty. Timur had had many sons, of many wives, as was the established custom of the time. There was no law of primogeniture. The eldest son did not automatically inherit the throne, nor was he gifted with quiescent brothers willing to live out their lives as governors of districts or provinces. At Timur's death, the throne had changed hands 4 times, one son or the other claiming it for his own for a brief while, driven from it when another had amassed enough of a threatening army. And so Shuja had lost his kingdom to his half-brother, Shah Mahmud. Shah Shuja put a hand on Ibrahim's shoulder. "First, you will not defeat me. How is that even possible?" When the younger man opened his mouth to protest, he stilled the words with a wave. "It's true. I might be a little older, Ibrahim, and that only means I've been wrestling longer than you have. And second, my wives dote upon you. Although," and he grinned again, a wicked gleam in his eye, "you will not win. They will minister to your injuries with enough of a fuss to make you happy." Ibrahim bowed his head. "We'll see, Your Majesty." Every now and then, Shuja and Ibrahim indulged themselves in the games and play of their childhood. There was so little else for them to do at Lahore and the Shalimar Gardens, a place where they had spent the last 3 years as guests of the wily Maharaja Ranjit Singh. This wrestling match was one such, conjured up late the night before, when the last cup of wine had been drunk, when the moon had skated downward into the dark sky, when the Notch girls had slunk away, and they had both been lying on their divans, twitchy with pent-up energy. What to do on the morrow? How to spend their time? Each day was like the others, the same views, the same fountains, the same watch upon the sun and the moon, to mark interminable time, gliding over that limited arc of sky above the gardens. The gardener had still been there last night, ensconced in a hollow in the trunk of the tamarind, when they had both sprung up, vigorous, shouting for him to come to them. He was a small, old man, his face carved in deep wrinkles that spanned out around his inscrutable eyes and curved in 2 semicircles from his nose to his mouth. His skin was a deep, clayey brown. His lower lip was crushed inward. He had no bottom teeth, and when he spoke, it was with slow, measured words that echoed out of the cavern of that mouth. Shuja had tried Persian first. "Do you know the rules of wrestling, my friend?" He had stared at them, his chin swaying loosely in the lower half of his face. So Ibrahim had spoken to him in Urdu. Again, nothing. "Try Pashto," Shuja had said in an undertone in that language. No luck there either. Why would he know an Afghani tongue, similar as it was to Persian, which he was more likely to understand? "Where does he come from?" Shah Shuja had said, exasperated. Ibrahim Khan had tried Hindustani last, having exhausted the little bit of Arabic he knew, and then the old man's mobile mouth had deepened into his face. "Ji, Sahib," he'd said, and so, pulling words out of their hybrid vocabulary, they had explained that they needed him at the Shalimar Gardens at noon to referee their wrestling match. They had taught him how to start the match, how to stop it at an illegal hold, how to impose a penalty, how to restart it. And now they stood at either end of the marble platform in the center of the pool in the middle terrace of the gardens, arms hanging loosely by their thighs, aware, out of the corners of their eyes, of the old man under the tamarind. Shuja saw his hand move and shifted quickly upon his toes. The old man put his fingers into his mouth and let out a tart, prolonged whistle. Shujah veered in surprise. This was not how he was supposed to start the match. In that brief moment of distraction, he heard Ibrahim's feet smack on the heated marble floor before he flung himself on his king. Shujah fell backward, rocked off his balance. He felt his feet slipping, strained against Ibrahim, until they were locked in an embrace. Their breaths escaped in harsh puffs. Ibrahim was smaller than Shah Shujah, shorter by a head's length, and he used that advantage to tuck his forehead under Shujah's arm and crush his ribs. They spun around the marble platform, holding desperately on to each other. All of a sudden, Ibrahim's clutch slackened, and his arm snaked from Shujah's back to around his right thigh. He heaved. Shujah came crashing down upon his back. As Ibrahim straightened to straddle him, Shujah kicked out with his leg. Ibrahim flew into the air, briefly, before smashing to the floor himself. When Shujah sprang upon him, Ibrahim rolled away and bounded up. They were already sweating when they started the match, but now moisture poured down from the thick hair of their heads and their beards. Shujah grappled with the slick skin on Ibrahim's legs. He had shaved his chest and legs that morning so that Shujah would have no hair to hold on to, and finally wedged his fingers into the waistband of Ibrahim's kispet. Yanked him down. Ibrahim yelled, "That's an illegal hold, referee!" The old man, massaging his face in bemusement, whistled again. In the thick silence of the courtyard, the sound boomed. A flock of parrots in the tamarind rose in a protesting flurry of green feathers and red beaks and disappeared into the pale sky. Shujah and Ibrahim hurled out of the hold and went to opposite ends of the platform. Their chests heaved. Their stomachs caved inward and out as they drew breath into their tired lungs, outlining their ribs and their hip bones. Agony flared in Shujah's lower back. There was a shock of burning along his right forearm, which he had put out to take the brunt of the fall. Ibrahim stood at his corner, wiping the sweat from his eyes, smiling. Smiling? Maybe there was some truth to the fact that he was younger and so stronger, Shujah thought. Although neither was really that old, Shah Shujah was 32, Ibrahim 29. They had not talked since the first whistle, no jibes, no trash, no filling the opponent's ear, and so his brain, with debilitating words. This was one of the rules of the game. It had to be played and fought in complete silence, with only muscle and brawn determining the winner. But the rules said nothing about facial expressions, an intimidating glare, a supercilious grin, like the one Ibrahim wore on his face. These were unaccountable quantities. Shah Shujah's breathing quieted. He felt his body come to rest again. He flexed the muscles in his arms. A sliver of iron lodged itself in his spine. When the 2 minutes had passed, the old man, keeping count of the seconds by beating his crooked foot upon the ground and raising puffs of red mud, whistled again. Shujah hurtled across and barreled into Ibrahim's chest. The force of the movement carried them over the knee-high marble lattice railing of the platform and out into the shallow pool. It was only luck that allowed them both to land upon the flat of the pool's surface, and not on one of the lotus bud-shaped fountains that speared upward. The pool was littered with these fountains, 152 in all, each spewing droplets of water that created 1,000 rainbows in the sun. Here the light fractured, dazzle bright. Shah Shujah shut his eyes and grappled, following only the sounds of Ibrahim's breath and his groans. At one point, Ibrahim held his king's head under the water, only 6 inches deep at any place, but enough to suffocate. Shujah reached out blindly with a long arm to seize his throat, squeezed his fingers tight until Ibrahim let go, and he could heave up to gulp in some air. Almost desultorily, the old man whistled again. He was learning, Shujah thought, as he climbed wearily back onto the platform and shuffled to his corner. The pool had a pebbled base strewn with chunks of semi-precious stones, jasper, agate, carnelian, which created a glitter of colors under the water, and which had left deep gouges on their backs and chests and arms, streaked now with blood. 2 minutes was all they got again until the old man whistled and they met at the center of the platform. The sun had burned off the water and some of the oil. Their holds were more secure. As his body spiraled into a bottomless exhaustion, Shah Shuja's brain snapped alive. The hours passed. The sun slipped westward. On the pavilion of the upper terrace, the Aiwan, a lone woman came to stand under the arches and looked down upon the 2 men struggling on the platform, arms fastened around each other, eyes shut against the sweat that streamed down their faces. Wafa Begum had been married to Shah Shuja for 17 years. The first of his wives, she was the person he knew best. His mother had been in a harem, and as a boy he was taken from it early, put into the men's quarters. There had been no actual friendship with other members of his family. Always lurking behind his half-brothers was the silhouette of their father's crown, impossible to ignore. Shuja loved Ibrahim, but it was a friendship in the outside world. When he was 15, his marriage was arranged with Wafa, also 15 that year, and all of a sudden he had found the comfort of home in the arms of this thin girl. Here, within the walls of his harem apartments, the young Shuja had confided in her his fears, his determination, his ambitions, and she had never laughed at them, never considered them impractical. Shuja's brother Shah Zaman ascended the throne of Afghanistan first, and then Shah Mahmud tore it away from him, throwing Zaman into prison, blinding him in both eyes with a piece of hot wire. And so Shuja built up his own army to overthrow Mahmud, ruled for 9 years himself, and in 1809, when he moved his court from Kabul to Peshawar, Mahmud sneaked up and grabbed Kabul, and then marched on to Peshawar. Wafa moved her slender hands restlessly in front of her, entangling her fingers in a veil which came over her head to her waist. To stay on in Peshawar, with Mahmud's army battering at the door, would have been death for all of them. The only option was to flee, to retreat, to find shelter elsewhere, to regroup and come back for Afghanistan. Shuja had woken her in the middle of the night and hurried her, along with the other women of his harem, to waiting horses and palanquins. "Go safely, my dear," he had said. At that last moment, when her hand reached out to him, when she swung her head through the gap in the curtains for one more look at her husband, not knowing if she would ever see him alive again, he pressed a packet into her hand and closed her fingers over it. "This will buy my life some day. Or," his steady gaze met hers, "if I die, it will make you rich." When Wafa unwrapped the satin cloth 4 days into their journey to the lands of the Punjab and Maharaja Ranjit Singh, she saw the armlet of heavy gold Shuja wore upon his person every day. The central diamond was mammoth, built with fire and light, flanked by 2 smaller diamonds. Shah Shuja had given her, the wife of his heart, the only woman he trusted, the Kohinoor diamond. Wafa watched a while, as one man and then the other pushed and jostled, as they fell with loud thuds upon the floor, as they broke the rules by snatching at beards or hair, as Shuja cried out when one of his fingers was caught in the railing of the platform and snapped with an audible crack. She flinched at that sound, but didn't move as they dragged themselves apart to rest. Her nose quivered and then wrinkled at the old man and his whistling. Wafa's veil, of a pure silk the color of newly opened pink roses at dawn scattered with dew, lay around her lean shoulders. Underneath she wore a short choli, a bodice that covered her breasts and was held together on her back with 2 strings. Her waist was bare, and she had on pink silk trousers tight on her hips, billowing around her thighs, caught up around the ankles. This was Wafa Begum's concession to living in India. adopting a part of the dress that kept her cool in the Lahore summers, and keeping the trousers that she wore normally in Afghanistan. She shifted against one of the pillars of the Iwan, resting her shoulder on it, her arms clasped around her waist. Her gaze drifted over the middle terrace to the old man at one side of the pool. He was squatting in the manner of a peasant, and a minute breeze brought the acrid tang of smoke from the smoldering bidi held in his hand. He turned suddenly to look at her. She stayed where she was, not caring that her face was uncovered, not bothering to pull the veil over her eyes. What did it matter? The old gardener had never ascended to the upper terrace, and the Iwan, where she stood, because it was the most private part of the Shalimar Gardens, one marked out for use of Shah Shuja's zenana. Such an old man could hardly have his blood boil at the sight of a woman from another man's harem, or be capable of doing anything about it. He was nothing, just another servant from Maharaja Ranjit Singh's court, sent here to serve them. She lifted her chin, looked pointedly away toward her husband and Ibrahim. There was dried, caked blood on their arms and chests. They moved slower and slower, doggedly, like two animals engaged in a mortal combat. "Your Majesty, you must eat," a slave said behind her. Wafa sighed. There was no point waiting for the men. There were rules in the wrestling match for penalties and illegalities, and even when and how the match started, but no rules for the ending. A few years ago, while Shah Shuja had still been the ruler of Afghanistan, he had wrestled with another man for 8 hours. Some matches had gone on for 2 days, or 3, until one of the opponents had dropped dead in the dirt. She put her fingertips to her mouth, kissed them, and then upended her palm and blew the kiss across the scorching air to her husband. Shuja reared his head, as though he had felt the touch of her lips upon him, and charged into Ibrahim with renewed vigor. "Please, Allah," she thought, as she walked away to the shamiana set at one end of the upper terrace where the slaves had laid out the food, "let them not kill each other." Perhaps they wouldn't kill each other in any case. Shuja loved Ibrahim with the devotion of a brother, and Ibrahim could not live with himself if he caused any harm to Shuja. For a deposed king there was no better friend than such a one as Ibrahim. She was worried, but only mildly, because she knew that the past 3 years of confinement, the past 3 years as Maharaja Ranjit Singh's guest, had fretted Shuja beyond measure. He needed to do something, anything. He needed to return to Afghanistan as a king. But Maharaja Ranjit Singh would not let them go until they gave him the Kohinoor diamond. Wafa Begum ate her food, bending over her plate, licking her fingers clean, delicately, listening to the snorts and rumbles that floated upward to the zenana terrace, her demeanor cool. She could have been feasting at a festival while still Queen of Afghanistan, so calm she was. But then, she was also the woman who had kept the Kohinoor safe from the greedy Ranjit Singh, and not let him have it for all the long years he had held her and her husband in captivity. In the end, the match lasted only until the sun set at 6 o'clock, and then only because the heated sun fell gratefully into the arms of the cooled earth, and darkness pounced upon Lahore. There was no twilight to speak of, no smudging of the sun's golden rays into pale blues and blacks, this close to the center of the earth. Shuja's whole arm was aflame. In one rest period he had ripped a strip of cloth from the knee of his kispet and wrapped it around the broken index finger of his left hand, binding only 2 fingers together so that he could have the rest to hold on to Ibrahim. But it hadn't helped. The hurt had crept up his arm and sent tentacles of torture over his shoulder and neck. Ibrahim hadn't fared any better. He had cuts and gashes all over his back and his chest, blood encrusted in some spots, fresh in others, where Shuja's nails had ripped through the wounds. He was also limping from having twisted his ankle sometime during that afternoon. An hour before...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?